It's an utter disgrace. The House of Lords is a tumour at the heart of our democracy. The House of Lords gets a free pass in this country, and I want to know why.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons.
There is no style, dignity, title and honour of Baron Hannon of Kingsclear.
That I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth.
It's just a memory of privilege and history.
In truth, many people don't understand what the House of Lords is, what the House of Lords does, or what the House of Lords tells us about the state of our democracy. So here's a few home truths about the Lords. And when I get to the end, ask yourselves, is this all symptomatic of a functioning, sane, sensible democracy? First, the history bit. The 21st century House of Lords is the modern-day incarnation of the Magnum Concilium, or Great Council, that advised kings back in the days when nobles were few and French-speaking, and when everyone else was a peasant chewing on turnips and dying from the plague. In the 14th century, another chamber, the House of Commons, popped up. But apart from a few brief years in the 17th century under the rule of Oliver Cromwell, the Lords remained the most powerful and preeminent legislative body in this country, and that was the case, incredibly, well into the 19th century. During that century, most of our prime ministers still sat in the House of Lords and provided the era's two longest serving PMs in Lord Salisbury and Lord Liverpool. Prime ministers continued to sit in the House of Lords into the 20th century, but after the Parliament Act of 1911, the House of Commons became the more powerful and preeminent house, and rightly so, because for all of its many flaws and faults and Nadine Dorrises, it is, boom, an elected body, even if our electoral system is too not fit for purpose, but we'll save that one for another day. So here we are in 2021, and the House of Lords remains the second chamber of the UK Parliament. The upper house, red, rich, and very, very velvety. Supposedly independent from, while complementing the work of the elected House of Commons. The House of Lords supposedly shares the task of making and shaping laws and checking and challenging the work of the government. And most people just accept it. And I say supposedly because the chumocracy is a thing in this country and patronage is rife. And every now and then you will hear otherwise sensible people making the case for it and saying,
I would argue that much of what the Lords does in terms of bringing up issues which are really alien to the government in the sense they don't want to address it because it's embarrassing or it's a difficult thing, like for instance female genital mutilation, which for years and years and years was off the agenda. The House of Lords put it back on the agenda.
They will argue that it has held the government to account better than Parliament ever did, or that it is better than an elected chamber because it's full of people imbued with a sort of higher spirit, a higher calling, who are not touched by the foul politic of those dirty voters. A lot of people cling to these notions, a lot of, as I say, otherwise very sensible people, and well, perhaps in a utopia where altruistic and well-informed senators might be able to make good decisions on behalf of other people, it could have some common sense. But we don't live in a utopia, and we don't live in that world, and we have never lived in that world. But people still cling to it, and cling to it they must, because once you start chipping at the guilt, you find yourself questioning how on earth has this club of political appointees, political chums, this anachronistic retirement home for politicians and bishops. Yes, bishops and hereditary lords and hangers-on. How has it been allowed to persist?
I don't defend the hereditary system. Obviously, you can't defend it logically. But equally, I don't apologise.
The House of Lords is wholly and utterly unrepresentative of modern Britain. A survey in 2017 found that of the 839 people then entitled to sit in the House of Lords, 74% were men, the average age was 70, and that Conservative peers comprised the largest group. There was also a sizable group of people in there aged over 90. Just 6% of the members of the House of Lords come from minority ethnic backgrounds. And since 2019, even though the number of active peers has been reduced to 782, there has been a rampage of Boris Johnson-facilitated peer appointment making, including Brexit poster boy and scourge of the unelected Brussels elites, Dan Hannan. And not forgetting Peter Cruddas, Tory party donor, and yes, you guessed it, a Brexiter, and scourge of the unelected Brussels elites, and Claire Fox, former Brexit Party MEP, and scourge of the unelected Brussels elites, and Joe Johnson, brother of Boris Johnson, and Charles Moore, Old Etonian, Brexiter, friend and former boss of Boris Johnson, and the former editor of the Daily Telegraph, and would you believe it, the scourge of the unelected Brussels elites.
In the EU, there's no such thing as a leader of the opposition. There's no opposition. There's permanent government by a governing class. And that's wrong.
The words massive and paradox are clearly absent from these people's dictionaries. Maybe they think that them being unelected elites are different to the Brussels so-called unelected elites. But fun fact, there are more Lords in the House of Lords than all MPs from all EU nations in the European Parliament combined. The difference is that those MEPs are not unelected, they are elected. Another fun fact, the UK has the second largest number of politicians in its parliament in the world after China. All of it funded, of course, by you and me, the taxpayer, who generously pays Lords £323 a day. They don't have to do anything, perish the thought. They don't have to speak or attend the chamber. They just have to turn up. And they don't even have to deal with any constituents because Lords don't have the piddling problems of constituents to muddy their hands. You just have to show up and ka-ching, £323 daily allowance. £323 is £5 more than an adult over 25 on universal credit gets a month. The only difference is that if you're on universal credit, you have to prove you need the money. Now, it's true that not all peers claim that daily allowance, but the vast majority do. Here's another fun fact. 12% of all members of the House of Lords are hereditary. Yes, folks, that's right. In 2021, the self-styled oldest democracy in the world has 92 people, all of them men, who sit in the upper chamber of our government because they have inherited the right to do so from an ancestor. And guess what? A good proportion of those 92 hereditary peers who, and let's repeat this, sit in the unelected upper chamber of our parliament by dint of an ancestor winning a battle or buying a peerage or being given a favour, backed Brexit. The irony bell is ringing loud and clear, but it seems that nobody is listening. Those 92 hereditary peers, all men, are a compromise because there used to be a lot more than that in there, but they managed to wangle a deal with Tony Blair, and now when a vacancy comes up, they hold an election to appoint another hereditary peer to take their place. The most recent appointee is Sebastian Grigg, 4th Baron Altrincham, who took his oath on the 1st of July 2021. You've probably never heard of Sebastian, but he's a former member of, would you believe it, the Bullingdon Club, and appears in that famous photo alongside Boris Johnson and David Cameron. Having failed to win an elected seat as a Tory MP in 1997, he became an investment banker before making it to the House of Lords, courtesy of that ancestor. I think they call this stuff levelling up, or even levelling upper class. Ah, the sweet smell of democracy. Or is it something on my shoe? Oh, and a special mention too for the 26 Lords Spiritual. Lords Spiritual. Lovely sound. Actually English bishops who have a feudal right to sit in the House of Lords and who have cleaved their cassocks to the red benches, with the exception of the unfortunate Cromwell years, for, well, forever. 10 times more people in the United Kingdom subscribe to Netflix than go to church, and yet the established English church still has significant influence in our upper chamber and bums on seats. Indeed, the UK is just one of 3 countries in the world with law-making clerics. The other 2 are the Vatican and, would you believe it, Iran. For the most part, the bishops vote with the Tories. Most vocally opposed the 2013 Same-Sex Marriage Act. It was they who inserted an amendment forbidding same-sex marriages in churches.
I and many of my colleagues remain with considerable hesitations about this bill.
People say the House of Lords has no power and no influence, but if so, why would it exist? It has power. That's why it's there, and that's why it persists. So, why am I ranting on about all of this? Well, because frankly, someone has to. It's an utter disgrace. The House of Lords is a tumour at the heart of our democracy. These lords pop up continuously on our TV and radio. They pontificate, and they are afforded a platform by the very fact of their feudal titles, which gives them respect. With a Prime Minister dishing out more titles to his cronies and packing the upper chamber with ever more of these unelected politicians, we all have to start asking questions as to how long we put up with this utter charade, how long we persist in affording hereditary peers or the likes of Digby Jones their place at the platform of our society. Remember, Brexit was about taking back control, wasn't it? But who got the control?
In these dark times that we find ourselves in, it's all too easy to feel passive and disengaged and hopeless. But there is something you can do. If you like the sound of a fearless, independent media outlet really trying to shine a light where the mainstream doesn't, then do sign up to Byline TV. You can hit the join button on YouTube or subscribe on Patreon. You can be part of driving meaningful change.